The last time I heard my mother, Margaret Ashland's voice, she left a voicemail instructing me not to come for Thanksgiving. She offered no reasoning, only saying we shouldn't complicate matters further. That happened 9 years ago. So when her contact popped up on my phone unexpectedly on a Thursday morning, I let it ring and didn't pick up. Instead, I just watched the display until it eventually dimmed. 10 minutes later, she sent a text. "We need to speak." It was urgent. Something about the Ashland estate. Only the estate. Nothing about the family or about me. Just the property itself. I chose not to respond, though I sensed there would be another attempt to reach me. My instincts were correct. Later that night, I received a second message, this one sent by my brother, Samuel Ashland. As detached and formal as ever, he addressed me as if I were merely an acquaintance. His email came from HR. "There was a disagreement involving the family fund. Your name's been mentioned. Could we arrange a meeting?" My own name. The very same one they had removed from every document, photo, and family group chat. The name that didn't appear on reception cards or Thanksgiving cards. This was the name that, until now, they had considered lost. I agreed to meet, not because I wanted to see them, but because I wanted to see just how desperate things had become if they were reaching out to someone like me. We sat down in a glass-walled office located downtown. It was neutral territory, sterile and far too polished to allow for honesty. Margaret Ashland, my mother, had already arrived, sitting there in a beige blazer, her regret clearly practiced. Samuel Ashland, my brother, was next to her, a legal pad in hand, turning pages as though he were leading a business meeting. There were no embraces or polite greetings, only a statement. "There's a detail in the will. I'm actually still on the Monroe Heritage Foundation as a conditional heir. I only have to confirm a series of dates. It should be over quickly." I gazed at them, the two who had severed ties with me as if I were a blemish in their legacy. And for the first time in many years, I found myself grinning. Fascinating. I remarked, "You tried to erase me, but apparently, I still serve a purpose in writing." I wasn't always unseen. There was a period when Margaret Ashland, my mother, would describe me to others as the understated success in the family. I consistently earned top grades. I played the cello. I always followed curfew. I was the child who made everything simple. Then the family fund came into play. It was my grandmother, Lydia Rossum's, idea. A plan to help each grandchild have a start for the future, whether it was for university, a business, or a house. She allocated a share for all of us. My portion was the first one funded. I still remember her script on the envelope, my future. But once Margaret Ashland was gone, everything shifted. At first the signs were small. My name disappeared from group family messages. They started organizing trips without including me. Margaret Ashland would look past me during dinner conversations, making me feel as if I had interrupted a private moment. Samuel Ashland's voice grew louder, and he became more animated in the conversation. He started referring to himself as the executive, almost as though he had rightfully earned the title. One evening, when I returned home from university for break, I discovered my bedroom had been emptied. No furniture remained, and the artwork was scattered on the floor. My mother, Margaret Ashland, was already in the process of converting the space into her yoga studio. She told me, "It's just easier this way," speaking as though I had been gradually fading, and she was simply adapting to the inevitable. That same week, I glimpsed a bank statement left on the kitchen counter, and it caught my eye just long enough for me to notice the family fund was now under a different designation. When I brought it up, my father, Douglas Ashland, quickly closed his laptop and dismissed me by saying, "You're being dramatic." But I knew I wasn't overreacting. I quietly began my own investigation. I downloaded and printed every record I could uncover. Screenshots, bank transfer records, copies of notarized documents signed by my grandmother, Lydia Rossum. I secured all of it in an encrypted, time-stamped digital archive. That became the turning point. Near the conclusion, everything came to a halt. The evening my family severed ties with me was devoid of any drama. There were no shouts, no bag left at the doorstep. It felt even more frigid than that. My father, Douglas Ashland, simply stated, "This household has no place for those who hold us back." Almost instantly, my calls stopped going through. Suddenly, my university tuition coverage was gone. The financial aid department flagged my profile as missing confirmed funds. When I reached out to find out why, the reply was, "Your family revoked permission." I tried following up with emails and writing letters, hoping for some kind of response. I was met with complete silence. Childhood friends of mine fell out of touch, ignoring my messages. One of them even told me that my mother, Margaret Ashland, had claimed I'd had a mental health episode and disappeared. I hadn't left on my own terms. Their actions had erased me. Eventually, I gave up all attempts to reach out. I relocated to a basement-level apartment across state lines. I accepted a position examining historic municipal documents for an archival company. My responsibilities were deliberate, unhurried, and peaceful. The job suited my temperament perfectly. I continued keeping records of everything that happened. Not to get even, but simply because recording it felt right. It was the only aspect I had any power over. As the years went by, I learned how to move through life unnoticed, how to cover rent on my own, how to start over with my credit, and how to track down legal precedents in 4 separate states. I stayed silent online. I never made any phone calls. But I kept watching, holding on to every detail. I reminded myself that wealth doesn't disappear. It just gets transferred to someone else. I kept in mind that signatures always leave evidence behind. Notary logs are accessible to the public. Family secrets, no matter how well hidden, always leave a trail of documentation. They assumed that erasing me meant I would be gone for good. What slipped their minds was that I understood exactly how the legacy was constructed. And now I can see precisely where it's most fragile. Once that conversation ended in the office with glass walls, I chose not to go back to my place. Instead, I strolled 3 blocks to a small, peaceful coffee shop, opened my laptop, and began searching through documents I hadn't reviewed in a long time. Their request was for me to confirm. I began with the timeline, determined to verify every detail. To start, I signed into the document vault where I'd stored records ever since leaving home. There were more than 400 files, each tagged, time-stamped, and doubly backed up. That included every tuition transaction, all modifications to the family fund, and each notarized note from my grandmother, Lydia Rossum. Although gathering these documents hadn't been an intentional preparation for something like this, it now struck me that perhaps this moment had always been preparing for me. On the following day, I called in sick so I could drive out to the municipal registrar's office. Legal structures for historical trusts are particularly distinct. My grandmother, Lydia Rossum's, property had obtained protection under a preservation contract since it housed architectural relics connected to early settlement in the region. Because of that, any inheritance required supervision. Oversight came not only from within my family, but also from the Monroe Heritage Foundation, a state nonprofit dedicated to monitoring historical sites. I put in a request for the public records related to the Ashland Foundation Trust, which served as the primary fund responsible for our family's real estate. The clerk arched her brow and requested identification. I offered her my business card instead. It read Independent Researcher and Estate Analyst. She handed me a USB stick containing 32 files. It was easy for me to spot what I needed. Inside was a scanned statement dated 6 years ago and labeled as a statement of heir withdrawal. My name, Harper Wynne, appeared on it, signed electronically and certified by a remote notary in Nevada. I had never set foot in Nevada. I had never submitted any kind of withdrawal. I focused in on the digital signature. It was identical to an earlier form I'd signed at 18 during the summer before university, when my father, Douglas Ashland, had me sign some revisions for the family documentation. They had duplicated that file, altered the date, retitled it, swapped out the notary, and resubmitted it to make it look as if I had disappeared willingly. That was how they managed to cut me out of the Ashland estate. Discreet, by the book, immaculate records. Yet they overlooked one crucial error. The original document was still in my possession. The metadata embedded in that file revealed that I had a time-stamped creation date, a file hash, and an access log, all confirming that I hadn't added my signature to anything after 2015. Better yet, I had stored that file in a cloud hosting service with blockchain validation, something academics use to confirm and secure timelines for research documentation. The backup wasn't just duplicated, it was protected by time lock verification. Someone had staged a removal, but the documentation proved I had never been officially eliminated. An ache began building behind my forehead, a mix of sickness and anger. The reason for their call wasn't that they missed me. They hadn't reached out because they had suddenly become more compassionate. Their real motivation was that the Monroe Heritage Foundation had reopened the file after receiving a report warning about missing heir records. If a beneficiary was erased without proper process, the family fund could have its assets frozen. The worst-case scenario was that the property might be claimed by the state or absorbed into the Monroe Heritage Foundation's educational operations. That was an outcome my parents, Douglas and Margaret Ashland, would refuse under any circumstance. They would prefer to part with the Ashland estate through a sale before letting that happen. I let that thought surface. The only solution, as far as they were concerned, was to get me to authenticate their fabrication. That was why they asked me to confirm the timeline, not for clarification, nor for accuracy, but for concealment. The bitter twist was that the very relatives who had abandoned, silenced, and erased me were now occupying territory they had no lawful right to claim unless I was involved. They requested a signature from me, a gesture, a quick fix. But what eluded them was my true purpose in returning. I wasn't there to contribute, but to scrutinize. During our next encounter, I didn't arrive alone. My companions were a laptop, a stack of printed documentation, and a device for recording audio. This wasn't because I craved confrontation, but because I needed them to be aware. None of these actions were happenstance. Our meeting took place in a second-floor conference room at a completely different legal office. It was once more neutral territory, albeit more cramped, with inferior chairs. It was exactly the sort of setting where disagreements are quietly resolved without fanfare. I entered the courtroom to find Samuel Ashland already inside, walking back and forth. Margaret Ashland sat by the window, her hands gripping a thermos of tea as if the warmth might calm her troubled mind. She got up as soon as I walked in, but I remained seated. Reuben Talbot, our family attorney, began the meeting with his typical formalities. He said, "We appreciate your presence, Harper. Let's begin with the Ashland Foundation Trust matter." I cut him off. "No, this is where we'll start." I pushed the printed statement across the table for everyone to see. This was evidence of the fraudulent withdrawal. Then I produced a second paper, my original document from 2015, completely unaltered and unsigned by any notary, uploaded and time-stamped 6 years before their document supposedly appeared. "I never took out a withdrawal," I told them, "and your notary was never properly authorized to certify documents for the family fund. The Monroe Heritage Foundation has already confirmed it." Samuel dismissed my concerns with a scoff. "You're exaggerating. We needed to reorganize. It's not a personal attack." "Forgery is very personal," I replied. I turned to Reuben. Your office submitted the revised document, right? I nodded slowly. Relying on paperwork supplied by the Ashland estate, I asked in an even tone, and if those papers turn out to be forgeries? He stayed silent, giving no response. I retrieved my last item, a portable storage drive. Setting it in the center of the table, I placed it carefully, as if it were an explosive device. Inside are the blockchain validation files, original documents, chain of custody information, IP records, and an audio message from 2017. I heard Margaret Ashland, my mother, telling someone that I was no longer considered family, explaining that they were streamlining the will. I saw her wince as she said it. Samuel muttered under his breath, "That could be anyone." I fixed my eyes on him and asked, "Do you actually want to challenge me on this?" Nobody spoke after that. Then, I outlined my conditions. You want the Monroe Heritage Foundation to leave you alone? Want to keep the Ashland estate safe and avoid being accused of fraud? All right then. Here's what I'm putting on the table. First, move the property into the Ashland Foundation Trust specifically for displaced youth. Second, release a public statement correcting the record, including my name and restoring my standing. Third, never reach out to me again. Samuel's voice wavered. That's absurd. You don't even care about the property. I grinned. What I wanted was the truth, validated by notarization. They didn't accept immediately. Margaret wept. Samuel accused me of being thankless. However, they didn't leave the room because they realized that if all this became known, they risked more than losing the Ashland estate. Their reputations, as well as their authority in every boardroom and charity gala, were on the line. My family cast me aside for appearances. Now, image was exactly what made them bring me back. They refused to sign then. People like my family don't yield without making a show of it. They stall. They perform. They inspect every word. But 1 month later, I received the documents, signed, stamped, and properly witnessed. The Ashland estate was placed into a public trust, managed by the Monroe Heritage Foundation. It had a new purpose: Ashland Haven for Transitional Youth, which would offer secure housing for teenagers driven from their households. I received a copy of the revised Ashland Foundation Trust Charter in the mail, slipped inside a simple brown envelope without ceremony. There was no accompanying note or apology, only an institutional signature and the date formalizing the change. I chose to put it in a frame. Within a few days, a local newspaper published a brief article. A private donation from the Ashland estate was made discreetly after internal disagreements. There was no mention of anyone's name or any sensationalism, just a brief note about legacy, supporting young people, and public caretaking. That was what I had hoped for. I didn't want attention, only for the record to be set straight. Yet my family couldn't resist their urges. Samuel sent me an email. It was curt, resentful, and exactly what I expected. Congratulations. I destroyed my own reputation just to make a point. I didn't answer. My mother, Margaret Ashland, left a voicemail. Her voice shifted from remorse to calculation. She wept, talked about the news coverage, and expressed hope that I might find some peace. Before she hung up, she added, "No matter what's happened, you'll always be my daughter." I played it once and then erased it, because there's something important about being unseen. Once I understood that I could go on without them, I no longer needed their acknowledgement. The last requisite step was an official correction made to the Monroe Heritage Foundation's newsletter. A single short paragraph explained that an administrative mistake had previously listed the wrong heir. The statement expressed regret for the error and confirmed that I held the original beneficiary status by law. My part in redirecting the Ashland estate was recognized with formal gratitude. There was nothing intimate or emotional about it. It didn't try to touch my heart. That was a good thing. It was forever. That same weekend, I took a drive farther north. I had no specific purpose, just a wish to inhale air that didn't carry so many old associations. On the outskirts of the next town, I paused at an unassuming graveyard. My grandmother's name, Lydia Rossum, was etched onto a simple headstone, surrounded by untamed blossoms and scattered stones. I hadn't visited since the service. I settled on the ground beside her grave. My visit wasn't long, lasting only until the words escaped my mouth. I let her know I hadn't held on to the property, but I honored her stipulations. I set a folded piece of paper next to the gravestone. Enclosed were the 3 original forms: Margaret Ashland's Ashland Foundation Trust requirements, my notarized affidavit, and the correspondence they attempted to substitute. After that, I rose to my feet. I shed no tears. Some conclusions don't call for weeping. Sometimes all they need is quiet. After I returned home, I created a new folder on my computer, named it Closure, and archived the files there. I preserved every piece of it: email threads, recorded calls, real estate conveyance certificates, and a final message I wrote to myself. They erased my presence to maintain their reputation. My reply was proof, not retaliation. That is what separates a true legacy from mere disclosure. I didn't experience victory. Instead, I felt washed, in a way that comes not from water and soap, but from knowing I was finally, irreversibly, finished. There are legacies that end with a burial. Some, though, begin again from an ending. The Ashland estate became a youth housing center 5 months after all the paperwork was finalized. The sign out front was understated: white painted wood, black serif lettering. It was labeled The Wynn House. The phrase underneath promised a fresh start. That wasn't a name I chose myself. The director of the Monroe Heritage Foundation told me she thought it described my role well. "You were the one who stood firm," she explained. I decided not to disagree. The initial group of residents arrived that summer. 5 young women, their ages ranging from 15 to 20. One had just transitioned out of the foster care system. Another had spent the past 2 winters moving from sofa to sofa, carrying nothing but a backpack and a GED study guide. None of the girls really knew who I was. Not truly. That was preferable to me. Each week, I led a legal literacy session at the Wynn House. I covered topics like reading a rental contract and how to appeal if your housing application was turned down. How to notarize my own story before someone else decides to change it. One night, as I gathered up my things, a girl, she was probably 18 with keen eyes and chipped nail polish, lingered after everyone else had gone. She looked at me and asked, "What happens if your family doesn't want you?" I hesitated before I answered. Finally, I told her, "You create a life so unshakable that no one can break it." She nodded, as if she had already started to do just that. Gradually, the house filled up in subtle ways: books piled on window ledges, socks laid out to dry on the radiators, and private jokes taped up on the refrigerator. It was a kind of acceptance that never needed anyone's permission. At my own apartment, I kept everything orderly and quiet. My phone number was unlisted, and no one had my forwarding address. I brought the rest of my grandmother Lydia Rossum's personal belongings to the Beckett room: her treasured fountain pen, a dictionary filled with her notes, and the pack of note cards she once used to send me birthday riddles. One evening, I found myself sitting in the living room at the Wynn House, where the girls were playing music on a battered Bluetooth speaker. Their laughter was raucous, wild, and unmistakably genuine. That was the moment I realized I hadn't simply left behind a family. I had built something far greater. What I created wasn't just a replica of what I'd given up. It was an improvement. It wasn't about having a seat reserved for me, but about making sure there was a place at the table for anyone who had ever felt excluded. 1 month later, Another letter arrived for me. It was handwritten, with no return address, but I instantly recognized the distinct cursive. It was from my mother, Margaret Ashland. In her letter, Margaret said she missed me, wished to see me, and hoped we could attempt a fresh start. I chose not to write back, not out of malice, but because I saw things clearly now. I wasn't holding on to old grievances. I had simply chosen to stop letting the past define my present. So instead, I stepped into the kitchen, unlocked the staff cabinet, and took out a fresh binder. I labeled that binder, The Real Family Tree. On the first page, I printed a simple question at the top. Who helped you survive? Each resident would be able to fill out a single branch. No surnames, no official connections, only honesty. That evening, I sat down and composed the initial entry. Name, Clara Yates, my high school librarian. Her actions gave me a way into the back office when I had nowhere left to turn. What she told me echoed in my mind. You aren't a problem. I was simply ahead of my time. The tree expanded gradually, just like everything meaningful does. And for once, nobody was erased from the story.